Welcome to No Remorse Woodworking, where I use reclaimed wood for various projects. As you may have seen in a previous video, I was recently featured in our local advertiser, and this led to a number of very positive responses, one of which was a gentleman who had this huge plank left over from something. It had been standing in his garage for at least 30 years. I went to pick it up, and it took 3 grown men just to lift it into my car. I only have a small car, fortunately, because I doubt I would have been able to get it on the ground from the bed of a pickup truck or something like that. It was almost 2 meters long, and I'm guessing it weighed at least 100 kilograms or maybe 230 pounds. Just to be able to manhandle it, I had to cut off about half a meter. And it was only because I had this big circular saw that I was able to cut that end off. It was a real struggle. The wood was very, very hard, and I think the blade was a bit dull. Although I did try, I couldn't cut through the plank at full depth. I had to make it in 2 passes and flip the plank over. And believe me, it was heavy. It was very heavy. At this point, I still didn't know what species of wood it was, but here you can see the grain structure. It's beautiful, isn't it? To figure out if I could use it for anything, I decided to cut off a couple of slices. And just as an experiment of what I could use it for, I decided to turn those slices into a cutting board. The rest of the block I squared up as best I could with my table saw, and then later I ripped some thinner boards from it. It was simply too heavy for me to handle. At this point in time, I was making a series of beech cutting boards, and I decided to use one of those as the framing around these very hard blocks. It was actually only later that I found out what species of wood this is. As you can see, things don't line up exactly. Some of the pieces weren't as square as I wanted them, so I had to put my table saw through its paces just to square everything up and to cut the sides straight, etc. I even used a miter saw to cut off one of the ends, but I forgot to film that particular segment. Now I'm ready to glue everything up. I'm using my gluing rails. This helps me to keep the pieces off the table. It makes it a lot easier to clamp them. And it gives me a nice flat reference when I glue up cutting boards. It's not my invention, I just made them out of wood. I've seen others make them from PVC pipe. As usual, I let the board sit overnight for the glue to set properly. I wanted the beech strips to go all the way around the board, so I needed to square up the ends after the first glue up. It's just a matter of cutting off the ends and then gluing on the strips. Just as before, glue, clamps, set overnight. I had really looked forward to seeing the final result of all this work. But just unclamping it, I was quite sure I was in for a lot of work. I started by using my small belt sander, but it quickly became clear to me that I was only sanding the beech and not the hard, dark wood in the middle. Nothing really happened while I was sanding. So it was time for a different approach. With my clamping rails in their secondary role as rails for my router sled, I then clamped everything up and started routing the surface flat. I have a video on that technique. It's not very hard to do. It does require a little bit of setup. I don't really have an excuse, but I was too busy filming to remember to wear my dust mask. Anyway, I routed both sides as flat as I could with this setup, and it is quite flat when I'm done routing. And I thought I only needed a little bit of sanding. Look closely at the surface. It's rather flat, but it's not smooth. And that's what it looked like when I started sanding. And this is 2 hours later with very limited progress and no end in sight. I had worn through several belts when I simply gave up. It wasn't worth all this effort. It was never going to be smooth enough for my taste. Shortly after I had given up sanding anymore, I had a visit from a woodworking friend who told me that the dark wood is in fact azobe, the hardest wood in the world. And I'd been trying to work it into something which is literally impossible to do. I just found that out the very hard way. I hope you've enjoyed this video about the hardest project I've ever done. If you have, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to receive notification when I upload new videos. Thank you very much.